Alright, so Xianyun's been out for a little bit now, so I want to go ahead and make a video discussing her constellations and which ones are the best for her to be pulling for. My name is Anchovies, and if you guys like this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. So before I even get into her constellations, I want to first just cover her base kit really quickly, just so we have a decent understanding of how Xianyun works and how she operates for as a unit and in the teams that she plays in. So firstly, Xianyun scales with attack percent, and more specifically, I mean that she ascends with attack percent. And in terms of base attack, she has the 9th highest base attack in the entire game. So that not only helps her reach really high attack levels, but reaching these levels are also very important to her buffing capabilities, which we will dive into with her passives later on in this video. So basically, starting with her elemental skill, basically you can do up to 3 leaps, and then with each leap, when you plunge, it increases the damage that the plunge does. However, it will always generate 5 particles, so especially if you're not really using her as like a DPS, you honestly just opt to use 1 leap before you then plunge to the ground. And then for her elemental burst deals an instance of AoE anima damage and does team-wide healing. Effectively does a similar thing like Jean, where you cast the burst and it does a bunch of healing. And then it summons this thing called a Star Wicker, and this provides several benefits. So firstly, it periodically heals the team based on her attack. The second thing is that it greatly enhances the active character's jumping ability and grants 8 Adeptal Assistance stacks. So being able to jump at really high distances allows the active character to consistently do high plunges, which is really good for characters like Diluc that already have really high plunge scalings. And in Diluc's case specifically, he already had this thing called Dragon Strike that allowed him to do plunges, but it required a very specific technique to pull off. It was kind of inconsistent unless in very specific scenarios. But now with Xianyun, you can pretty much reliably do this. And because he has a high scaling when you pair him with something like C6 Bennett, it allows you to do some pretty nice damage. It makes him a really nice unit actually now. But anyways, back to the kit. So when you have these stacks, basically each plunge attack from the active character will consume a stack, and then it will deal an instance of AoE anima damage. And these Adeptal Assistance stacks will matter a lot more when I get into her Ascension 4 passive. Her burst lasts for 16 seconds and has an 18-second cooldown, also costing 70 energy, so of course you will have higher energy requirements, which ideally go into the 180 range, especially if you're not using her in like a Zhao team or like with another Animo unit. In teams where she is the solo Animo, you're easily going to be reaching thresholds of 180, 190, 200, even above 200. Hell, you can be reaching like 220. So this makes holding weapons like Thrilling Tales a lot more difficult in solo Animo teams, so that is something to keep in mind. And you usually want to use her burst towards the beginning of rotations just because of how long the uptime is. Usually you can opt to use her either first or second, just depending on the team. In most cases, you usually use her second. Like for example, if you have Farina on the team, you would use Farina and then Xianyun. Or if you have a more specific rotation, she could even come second to last, like in the 3rd place before your main DPS character if you're holding something like Thrilling Tales in like a Zhao team or something. So now I have her first passive, which basically increases the plunge crit rate based on the number of enemies that her elemental skill hits. So this obviously scales well when you're in multi-enemy scenarios. However, the increase only goes from 4 to 10%, so like it's a minor crit rate increase. However, it's not like horrible, but it's nothing like crazy broken. It's just like a nice little boost in damage that can be somewhat helpful. And then we have her most significant talent pretty much in like her entire kit, which is her Ascension 4 passive. Now this increases the plunge attack damage when an Adeptal Assistance stack is consumed. And when it is consumed, the next plunge, or I guess the shockwave damage, basically it's like an additive base damage bonus, and it scales with 200% of her attack, and it'll cap at a 9,000 damage increase, which requires Xianyun to have a total of 4,500 total attack, which is very hard to reach, and honestly you shouldn't really aim to be reaching for this max threshold because it's, I don't even know if to say virtually impossible is like the right way to put it, but it's very difficult without like super high investment. So most ideally you often get like around 2,800 to like 3,200 attack for like most average builds, but being able to get this high is still nice because even when you don't reach the max threshold, on the average builds when you get like 2,800 to like 3,200, you're looking anywhere from like a 5,000 to like a 7,000 additive base damage bonus. And the base damage bonus works similar to like Shunha Quill's or like Yunjin's base damage bonus, which is really good for plunging characters, and this is what makes it her significant key part of her kit. So now that we've got the kit out of the way, let's now get into her constellations. So her C1 basically gives an additional charge to her elemental skill, similar to something like Baiju C1, Now this does effectively reduce her energy requirements, so like for example in like a Gaming, Bennett, Farina, Xianyun team, you're typically looking anywhere from like 200 to 220 ER depending on the situation, and this can effectively reduce it down to closer to like 150 and 160 because you can get those 2 charges per rotation off the bat with Xianyun. So this extra skill charge, and especially the fact that her elemental skill generates 5 particles regardless of how many leaps you do, is very nice for her energy requirements, and in some situations can allow you to run just triple attack and just completely ignore her energy stats altogether. However, I would say that's more specifically in the case if you're running her in like a double or more Animo team with like Xiao, Xianyun, and then maybe like one more Animo or something. Or like if she's a solo Animo, then you're running her with like Oathsworn Eye at R5. This more incentive to be able to invest in more attack on top of just lowering her energy requirements does inherently give a minor DPS increase, usually about like a 5 to 8% most cases. And then we have her C2, and my god, the C2 is very strong. So firstly, it increases the attack after she uses her elemental skill by 20% for 15 seconds, and then on top of that, it basically doubles the effectiveness of her Ascension 4 passive. So instead of 200% of her attack being put into her Ascension 4 passive, it's now 400% attack, and the damage limit is from 9,000 to 18,000. Now this doesn't mean that the total attack to cap it out changes at all, it's just how much attack it scales with, and it's effectively doubling this additive base damage increase, which is a lot. It's like a lot, and I would honestly say this is definitely her best constellation in terms of value, both to herself and to the team, and just it's so good. And from a team DPS perspective, you're easily looking upwards of easily above 10% DPS, like easily. At like higher levels of investment, I could definitely see this constellation reaching upwards of like 20%, especially if you have like C2 R1 and then you have like R1 of some other 5 stars or like a couple 4 stars. I could easily see this damage increase being even more significant, which makes this constellation it's a very worthwhile constellation if you're able to go for it. Her C3 and C5 increase her elemental burst and elemental skill talent levels by 3 respectively. Nothing crazy, just gives slightly more healing in the burst side and then a little bit more damage on the skill side. Nothing crazy. Her C4 grants some team-wide healing from her elemental skill, and it increases with the number of leaps. So doing 1, 2, or 3 leaps basically increases the healing by a certain percentage, which in a case scenario like say for arena teams can help her generate more fanfare easily, or I guess reach the max fanfare quicker. But it's like Xianyun's burst healing is already more than enough to reach max fanfare in a lot of scenarios, so it's like it's sort of just kind of extra healing that like you don't really need. It's kind of just there. And then of course her C6 turns her into, I guess, her own main DPS mode, because when she does 1, 2, or 3 leaps, the elemental skill's crit damage is 15%, 35%, and 70%, which is a lot when you take into consideration how much scaling her elemental skill actually has when you level it up all the way. And then it effectively resets her elemental skill, so you can basically just spam her skill. Although do keep in mind that you don't get particles from the resets, only the initial skill cast, I think, which is like her initial skill and then like the C1 additional charge, which honestly is fine because you don't need that many anyway. And when you have her at C6, then you can of course run her with things like attack, ammo, crit, or some crazy build. I don't know who's using C6 Xianyun. Y'all can let me know what DPS build she's running. I would assume it's like attack, ammo, crit with like VV or like Desert Pavilion Chronicle or something crazy like that. I don't know. So now how about R1 Crane's Echoing Call, her best in slot weapon? So what does that give? So her base attack on this weapon is 741 with a 16.5% attack. So it has a really high base attack, which is good for Xianyun because her damage increase scales with her attack. And when she has more base attack, because she already builds a ton of attack percent in her kit, because she ascends with attack percent, already builds it into her artifact stats, having more base attack helps with her scaling a lot more than more attack percent. And then in its passive, it increases the team's plunge attack damage by 28%. And on top of that, it restores 2.5 energy to her each time somebody plunges, and goes up to 20 energy can be restored in this way. And this effectively gives her energy reduction that is very similar to her C1. So back to the Gaming, Bennett, Farina, Xianyun example I was talking about, you're looking at something going from like 212 to like maybe closer to 150, which is a very similar reduction. And compared to just C0 using something like Oathsworn Eye, for example, it actually does have a higher DPS increase of around 10% and does perform better. So if you are somebody who's just going for C0 Xianyun, then it would be better to get C0 R1 than to run C0 and then like Oathsworn Eye or something like that if you're using it as like a solo animal or like Thrilling Tales. So overall, what does this have to say about Xianyun in terms of her constellation or her weapon investment? Well, I would definitely say that C1 effectively does the same as her R1 on her weapon, and ironically, she can actually run a full attack percent build and yield more attack with C1 compared to her R1. But despite this, R1 would still perform better simply due to the passive also granting the character's plunge attack damage percent bonus, which is relevant. And also the C1's higher attack threshold isn't really super big because it's only by like 10's value worth. Like I think it's only increased by like 70 or 80 attack, which is not significant enough to make it to where C1 can just completely outrival R1. So overall, if you were comparing C1 versus C0 R1, C0 R1 definitely beats C1. However, C2 definitely provides the biggest DPS increase in comparison to all of that, and is for sure her best constellation to aim for. And it's even better if you get it at C2 and R1. If you can get her C2 R1, it's really good. You've pretty much got like a really good Xianyun on your hands right there. So if I was to say in terms of team DPS increase and overall value or investment, I would say prioritize getting C2. If you don't think you have enough for C2, you can maybe try doing Z0 R1 or getting her C1, or just leaving her at base with C0 and just rocking like an Oathsworn Eye or like a Thrilling Tales, or just your other casual weapons that would be useful for Xianyun. Alright, and that is this overall quick little Xianyun constellation video. I hope that you found this helpful, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content. And until the next video, which is a Nahida video, bye bye.